Alchemy of Cacao, chocolate. And you know what? Running a little bit late, I think cleared out a little bit, so I'd love to make it a little less formal than I was thinking and have this as a little bit of a dialogue. If you guys have questions, if you have concerns, see a therapist. If there's anything I can talk to you about in terms of chocolate, plants, and anything that comes up for the next, 45 minutes or so, please just ask. We can have this as kind of like a half chat, half Q&A, a little bit of presentation. So since there's so few of y'all here, first just thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest in chocolate and cacao. Is there anything, just to start off, as I make sure I hit those particular bases, that you guys want to know? Any dying questions or topics? I could probably talk on chocolate for like 5 hours without saying the same thing twice, so yeah.
Why do I like it so much?
We'll definitely go over that. Yes, definitely do that one. Anything else?
How to maximize, if you're going for a big experience with chocolate, what could you do to add to it or boost it, extend it, if you want to do a religious big experience?
More is more.
Yeah.
For once. But yeah, we'll talk about that too. Okay, great. Well, like I said, my name is Brian Wallace. I am a chocolate maker, and I call myself a chocolate alchemist because I think what I'm doing with chocolate goes beyond chocolatiering. It goes beyond making chocolate bars, making confections, making different things like that. For me, this whole thing is really, in essence, a spiritual practice for me. I developed myself through developing these different tools, made of chocolate that I ingest, that alter my consciousness, that alter my physiology, and do that for other people as well. So I do really feel that it's an alchemical process. This isn't just I'm in the kitchen making a food for a meal or something like that. There's intention behind it to a pretty serious level. I'll talk a little bit later about how complex it is to actually make chocolate. But simply said, going from the cacao seed that we get from a tree all the way up to either like a ritual ceremonial beverage or like a chocolate bar that you guys are probably all familiar with. It's the most complicated and process-intensive thing that humans consume, second only to vanilla. So all different types of things need to be done to get cocoa beans into a state that one, can just eat them in, and two, that are pleasant to eat them in. So I got into chocolate through a lifelong obsession with plants. I grew up a farmer. Almonds, and corn, and onions, and black-eyed peas, and all kinds of good stuff like that. I'm a gardener. I've been studying medicinal plants and mushrooms, fungi, my entire life. And cacao, for me, became a vessel or a conduit for me to express this interest in plant medicine, in mushrooms, and things like that. When I started understanding that cacao actually historically functionally had been used like that. So you guys all probably are aware that the oldest medicines that we have are just herbal teas. So we didn't have tinctures or extracts, we didn't have pharmaceuticals and things like that. For the majority of our human existence, we had teas. Hot water brewed with herbs over a fire. And cacao has a bunch of super interesting compounds in it that enhance or affect the ability of medicine to go deeper into our physiology and just to simply have the effect that they have. So in areas of the world where cacao is from, which is Central South America, cacao has historically been used as an adjunct to these medicinal teas or medicinal brews and beverages because it enhances their effect. So, having this huge obsession with plants, with fungi, and not really knowing what I was going to do with that intense burning passion. Once I started playing around with chocolate myself and making different confections at home, different treats that were admittedly pretty terrible, because I was just getting started out, I felt like I was tapping into that historical context a little bit. And now, years and years later, this is what I do. So I have a chocolate company. I'll pass around some chocolate for you guys to try out. This really is something that I spend really every living, waking, breathing moment. In between, farming and today, I picked up a degree in essentially botany and biochemistry, and love to talk about the science of chocolate, why it makes us feel good, why we love ingesting it, why it's such a universal, universally loved. There are very few things, there are very few foods, there are very few vices, there are very few medicines that are so widely accepted by so much of a percentage of the human population as chocolate. Which is great, it's fascinating. So it really does ride the line between like a food, a medicine, I think a sacred substance, and a drug. So a lot of those things too are dependent upon how it's prepared, how it gets from the tree that it grows on into your body, and all of the different steps that happen in between those stages. So I want to talk a little bit about those. How many people have had fresh cacao fruit straight off the tree? Couple, okay. You can usually tell because people have a really big smile on their face when they've had that. So if you're in any of the tropical parts of the world, cacao, like I said, naturally from Central and South America, but due to its popularity and its acceptance, has made it all the way around the world now. We have it growing in Asia, we have it, of course, growing in Africa. We're now more than 70% of the world's cocoa is actually grown, which is, of course, left over from slavery and slave trade. We can talk about the modern iterations of that and how that's still very much alive and real. But cacao does grow in tropical areas, 20 degrees plus or minus from the equator. So if you're in an area that's tropical, it's warm, it's near the equator, and you hear there's cacao around, find it, hunt it out, eat the pulp, suck on the seeds. This is the oldest form of chocolate ingestion there is, or cacao ingestion there is, because it's edible straight out of the pod. So the cocoa comes in these giant football-shaped pods. It can be any color of the rainbow. They grow directly off the trunk of the tree, not like a peach or a plum or a cherry or something like that, the fruit that we have in North America where it grows out the tips of the branches. It actually goes straight from the trunk of the tree, and it's kind of this Dr. Seussian kind of look to it. They change colors, they ripen over time, and when you crack them open, they're ripe. They have this tart, almost like yogurty, lychee, mangosteen type of pulp that surrounds them, called baba. That's filled with all kinds of delicious starches and sugars and things like that, which start to break down and ferment spontaneously from the bacteria that are in the air, which is why we don't get fresh cacao pulp unless we're in those equatorial areas, those really hot, humid, tropical places. So find it, try it out, and I promise you will not regret it. So just a little bit on the story of where chocolate comes from too, where cacao comes from. So after you pluck that pod from the tree and crack it open, all of the bacteria and the yeasts and all of essentially the microbiome of that physical place spontaneously start interacting with the starches and the sugars and the moisture that are inside that cocoa pod to start fermenting those 40 to 60 cacao beans that are contained within each one of those pods, which is about, as a reference point, about as much as it takes to make one chocolate bar, one standard size chocolate bar. So start fermenting, and this is really where, in my opinion, that alchemy begins, because those seeds, when they come straight out of the tree, they're actually bright purple. So like this, just like any of these bright, super psychedelic purples that you see in the art around this room, which most people don't see cacao like that. It has a huge amount of these tannins and saponins and other compounds that if you were to bite into, if you were to kind of suck off that baba, that filament, that like yogurty, delicious, sweet substance off the outside of the bean, and bite into the bean, it's nasty. It's tannic. It basically makes your whole mouth turn into like a puckered, dried raisin or something like this. It's very unpleasant. So what happens in the fermentation is the bacteria and yeast naturally present in that area start to ferment the cocoa. They start to increase the temperature of the cocoa beans, and it starts to actually, I use the term mature, or break down a lot of the tannins and saponins, and it changes the isometric conformation of some of the antioxidant compounds that are naturally present in the cocoa. So a lot of the antioxidant compounds that are in cocoa are those purple compounds. So you guys are familiar with like acai, blueberry, all of these like super antioxidant rich foods. Cacao is at the top in terms of antioxidant content of food compounds or food substances. So, but it's almost like there's too much in there. Like having that much of those compounds actually in your mouth is really unpleasant. So what the fermentation does is it doesn't break those ones down. It actually changes their chemical structure just slightly to make them, one, more palatable to us, and two, more bioavailable to the human digestive tract. And then actually when we ingest them, when we ingest those cocoa beans or we ingest that chocolate, our own internal microbiome, the beneficial bacteria that we have in our gut, continue to change. They don't break down, but these antioxidant compounds are changed. People that have like a chemistry background, they actually change the isomer conformation. So it's basically like you can't put a left-handed glove on your right hand. So they're changing you could say the handedness of these compounds to make them fit into the receptor sites or the structures in your body to actually be able to absorb them. So both the bacteria naturally present in the native ecological environment that cacao grows do this, and then a completely different subset of bacteria in your gut continue the process. So super fascinating. There's no real other food. There's really no other substance that we ingest that has that kind of thing happening with it. So in addition to the fermentation that happens in the field, well, I should talk about raw chocolate, since we're talking about fermentation. So raw chocolate has become, or maybe it's fading out, maybe it's just becoming more popular wherever you are. It's a thing. The thing about raw chocolate, though, is that fermentation process, all of those things that I just described that naturally, spontaneously happen right out in the field, actually need to get up to 130, 140 degrees to do the work that they're doing on that molecular level to break down some of those compounds that are unpleasant to consume, and also increase the bioavailability of the compounds in it that we do want in our physiology, that do positively impact our health. So, contrary to popular belief, raw chocolate is debatable on whether it's something that is good, or whether it's going to actually taste as good as it can, because there's bacteria actually responsible. The quality of the fermentation, of course, is actually responsible for the palatability and the bioavailability of all of these different compounds that are good for us, which I want to talk in much more detail on as well. So, and I'm going to speed through the rest of the steps a little bit, but just to say that all of these different steps can also be slightly modified along every step of the way to either increase or decrease different components of flavor, different components of aroma, or different components of how cacao or chocolate influences our physiology. Which is important because cacao is, from the seed, one of the most biologically diverse or chemically diverse substances. That's why it kind of rides the line between food and medicine and drug, all of these different things, because of just this sheer volume and subsets and types of compounds that it contains within it. So back to how we get to cacao or chocolate that we would actually consume. Some people might consume it as those fermented and dried beans. That's kind of maybe one of the more historical uses, was just taking these whole beans and dipping them in honey. That's, if you see me out on playa, hit me up for some cocoa beans and honey sticks, because I'll pretty much always have them in my pocket. And that's actually how I got into chocolate as this euphoric substance in the beginning, was just having cocoa beans as a snack. And chewing up, 3, 4, 5 cocoa beans in the afternoon while I'm sitting there working on email and a whole life, and had this like euphoric feeling wash over me. And I was kind of like, what the hell is happening? Did I take the wrong supplement? How did it work? I don't know. Did I bring 2CB to work or something? I don't know. Yeah, which is an inside joke that one of our friends actually did that. Anyways, cocoa beans as like a euphoric, uplifting snack. You take those cocoa beans to make chocolate. You can roast them, you can not roast them. It's kind of a preferential thing. The roasting does, if it's not overdone, changes the bioavailability of a completely different class of compounds. So light roasting, but not an over roasting, subtly enhances flavor and also increases the bioavailability of certain other classes of compounds that we want to be ingesting in chocolate as well. Those are the ones that would benefit the heart, what you would say are heart opening, and they're literally and figuratively heart opening. So people that have been to cacao ceremony understand that, or have had this rich ritual kind of ceremonial dose of cacao, understands a very heart opening experience, and your physiology and the actual tissues and vasculature of your heart are dilated. It's because a lot of these compounds are actual vasodilators. Increase blood flow, increase the size of the vessels, which helps also, just by default, increase blood flow. So after we roast the cacao, we winnow it. We take the husk off, which is like a thin, papery shell, you could say, off these cocoa beans. And that's actually where a lot of the mineral content is locked up. So historically, you have people like the Bri down in Costa Rica and Panama, like in the border area right there. I've got to spend a little bit of time with, who would consume cocoa husk tea or cocoa tea around the times of blood loss. So like menstruation, monthly menstruation, where you potentially need, depending on your physiology, some iron supplementation or some mineral supplementation, magnesium, things like that. So historically, that husk was actually drank just as like a nutritive tea to help replenish times when physiology was losing blood. Or of course, like after an injury or something like that, trauma, things like that. So we take the husk off because the FDA has basically said that you can't put cocoa husk into chocolate and still call it chocolate. So we lose that husk in the chocolate making process typically. Some people are now starting to sell cocoa husk tea, which is nothing like hot chocolate. It's more like iced tea. It's pleasant to drink, it's delicious. Some cafes are starting to sell it, things like that. Try it out if you see it somewhere. But then through that winnowing process, the removal of the husk, we get the nibs. And that's really where, I feel the potential of cacao is contained within. So from that nib stage, people are probably familiar with putting like cocoa nibs on your granola or things like that. The nibs are actually what we use to make chocolate, or what I use to make our ceremonial cacao. So You take those nibs and crush them down. Historically, this was done on like a metate or like a stone grinding rock, where you're crushing the nibs and like working it back and forth until it gets to be this kind of like peanut butter, kind of this chunky peanut butter kind of consistency, and then continuing to grind it until it gets to be this kind of smoother paste, or sometimes people call it liqueur or mass. And this is still, of course, 100% cacao. And from there, that's when we would make our beverage. Now, in the kitchen, I have larger like, stone grinders that can do this process. Grind down the particle size from the nib into something that's much more smoother to consume. So, and of course, how all of that's done, conching can be a part of that process, which is where we like vigorously whip air into this molten liquid chocolate. And what that does is it removes some of the volatile acetic acids and things like that, some of the more astringent compounds, mouth-puckering things. And if overdone, will begin to oxidize different components of the cacao. So that means that it'll break down a lot of the things that are naturally uplifting or beneficial to the physiology as well. So an oxidative reaction is where typically where something is damaged, and, may or may not produce free radicals and things like that. So there's this very fine line in optimizing all of these different kind of processes. So then we have this molten cocoa mass, which melts by virtue of the cocoa butter that's naturally present in that whole cocoa bean or those cocoa nibs. So about 50-50, there's about a 50-50 split in the nib of fat and cocoa powder. So when we start grinding it, the heat from friction naturally starts to melt and release the lipids that are in the chocolate, that are in the cocoa beans, which produces this molten mass that's kind of like, has a consistency of, like really thick paint or, melted chocolate. At that point, we might add our sugar, we might add, of course the standard is refined cane sugar, which I didn't have a lot of, or so much of it. In my diet, there's coconut sugar, there's maple sugar, all these different types of unrefined sweeteners, or even non-caloric stevia kinds of things that you can use. Introduce that into that grinding process until the particles of that get smooth and round down, and then you have essentially molten chocolate. And then you go to the next stage of the process to go from that molten phase into an actual chocolate bar or confection would be tempering. And tempering, of course, is kind of this other chemical component of the process where we're actually fluctuating the temperature in a very concise, narrow range, much like steel is tempered, to get the particles and actual molecules that are contained within the molten substance to line up and crystallize in a particular way. And tempered chocolate is, of course, the chocolate that you would get like from a grocery store or something like that, where it's smooth, it's shiny, it has a gloss to it, and it melts much, much, much slower than untempered chocolate. So if you've ever, the contrast would be, if you've ever taken a chocolate bar and it's melted, like you let it out, sit out on your dashboard, melted, and then it re-solidified, and it kind of looks dusty and dingy and things like that, it's no longer tempered. So then it's going to be crumbly, it's not going to have a nice snap and things like that. Anyways, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of making chocolate without talking about this more alchemical side of chocolate in terms of actually how we can ingest it in this kind of like ceremonial context or ritual context, which is what I'm super passionate about these days. This is one of my original interests in chocolate. It was actually consuming it as this ceremonial beverage and trying to help cacao get back into the limelight as its own plant medicine, as an entheogen, as something that can be consumed in that kind of manner. A lot of us are, for the last 200, 300 years have been, last couple generations have been raised on confections that were watered down with things like sugar, with things like milk, that were made by people that were just trying to spread out that chocolate flavor as much as possible and dilute it as much as possible to dilute that, super precious substance. It's very hard to procure, it's very hard to grow, and of course it's very hard to make. Going back to that molten chocolate, the molten cacao phase, that's the point where we would stop all of it. We wouldn't go through tempering, we wouldn't add our sugar, we would just stop at that molten phase where we've been grinding and making the particle size of the powder smaller and smaller and smaller until we get this 100% cacao or 100% cacao liquor, paste, mass. You'll see those things on ingredient statements. You'll see those words tossed around online and in books and things. They're all the same thing. It's ground cacao nibs. And that's what we would use as this kind of ceremonial beverage. And that's traditionally what was used, was just these ground cocoa nibs, slightly roasted and ground and mixed, always with water, typically with an herbal tea as well. So. And always in these kind of like ritual, ceremonial contexts. So if you look at the old, like Central Mesoamerican, Mayan glyphs, Aztec glyphs, and things like that, you'll notice that cacao was always consumed in this celebratory context, but also that it was prepared in this kind of form of ritual theater. So you can see that, like, the froth, the actual mixing of the chocolate. Very hard to do. Nowadays we have, our highly fetishized $400 Vitamix blenders that do all the work for us in 30 seconds. But historically, you'd be grinding on a stone grinder, and then to produce the froth, the foam, and things like that, you'd be pouring from one vessel to another for 10 minutes at a time, 20 minutes at a time, hours at a time, back and forth from vessel to vessel, crushing the cacao in between. And you look at these old Maya glyphs and you see people off these, like, from way up above, stories up in the sky on a building, pouring cacao down to where people are kind of like celebrating, and then other people taking that same goblet and walking upstairs to do it again, and they're just pouring back and forth. And it really was a special and sacred experience. It wasn't something that you could just go down to the 7-Eleven and buy a Hershey's chocolate bar for 49 cents and call it done. It was rare. It was typically reserved for priestly class or saint class, or even as currency. So cacao, of course, used as currency, and this is due to how special, how uncommon it was. So of course the priest class or the ruling class and things like that were the ones that were literally eating their money, and the only one that could actually afford to be doing such a thing. Any questions on all of that? How are the nibs different from the bean?
Yeah. What is it eliminating when it does it as nibs?
So we got fermentation, drying the whole bean, and then once the whole bean is dried, we roast it. Makes the whole bean a little bit more brittle, and then we do a process called winnowing, where we take the thin, papery husk off of the bean. And typically the way that happens is the whole thing is crushed, and the whole bean is crushed, and that thin, papery shell, which is, again, where all that kind of mineral content is, that's much, much lighter than the nib. So the nib still has all the fat and the cocoa powder contained within it, whereas the husk is very thin and light. And what actually happens, what we do is we essentially vacuum off the husk. So we take the husk off of that crushed mix of nibs and husk, which in their whole state is the nibs in the shape of a bean, covered in all dimensions by a husk. So you could think of it like Like, you know, like an almond's white on the inside, right? And it has a brown shell or a brown husk. So if you've ever had like a blanched almond where that brown outer part is removed, we're essentially doing the same thing with cacao, but the part that we're removing is much thicker and separates much more easily. Does that make sense?
That's the husk.
That's the husk component.
That just has nutritional value. Does that have
It has a very high mineral content, but that's the majority of what it has.
no active?
As far as I know, it does not. Now, the thing that's worth saying, especially in context of a lot of what I'll talk about in a sec about all of the different things in chocolate that make us feel good and influence our physiology, is that cacao is, 20, 30, 50 years behind the times in terms of the amount of scientific research that's actually come out on what is in different components of it, and also how all of these different steps in processing influence the different levels of these compounds, whether those are nutritional components like vitamins, minerals, or secondary, phytonutrients or adjuncts or alkaloids or things like that.
So when you eat the seed by itself, that's before any kind of fermentation or anything, is that just raw?
When you eat the seed, you probably wouldn't be eating the seed before fermentation.
So when you eat the seed, you're talking about it.
They're just dry. They're fermented and dried. Yeah, fermented and dried. Sometimes roasted. Yeah.
So, what's the best way to ingest chocolate with all its, medicinal properties, like commercially available? Like, I'm not really sure. So, what is available in the market, and what would be the best way to ingest chocolate to get maximum benefit?
Did everybody hear the question? No. So the question, and I think the question was, and feel free to add to this if you want, was what's the best way to consume cacao or chocolate to actually absorb a lot of these beneficial compounds? And I would say that drinking it warm in a beverage is kind of the optimal way, and what I would usually recommend, and that's also the historical. That's historically how chocolate has been consumed. So, we've been consuming confections and chocolate bars, things like that, sweetened chocolate items. But really, we've been consuming it as chocolate for 200 or 300 years. We've been consuming cacao seeds or cacao paste, cacao liquor, that ground version of the nibs that's like mixes into water a little bit better than a nib would. We've been consuming that type of cacao for over 5,000 years. So if you think about historically, humanity's relationship with cacao really is grounded in this beverage. It's really grounded in this ceremonial style beverage that was usually drunk in these celebratory contexts. And I think that the heat, the combination of heat and having the fat still present in that cacao are very important components to actually absorbing everything and having the maximum amount of bioavailability to absorb everything.
So you would look for cacao powder?
No, I would not look for cacao powder. So maybe I could do one of my classical 15-minute answers to your question.
So how do I make the beverage?
I guess the succinct way to say it is I would look for a ceremonial cacao, which now in the last several years has actually become much more of a trending thing that's available in the marketplace. So if you were to Google ceremonial cacao, that is something that you can actually find now. There are a few companies making it. I produce it, and typically it's not a powder. So just to rewind a little bit too, on going back to where we've winnowed the cocoa beans, we've taken that husk off, then we have the nibs. We start crushing the nibs, and we still have 100% cacao, right? So we grind down the nibs the fat starts melting. We have this molten cacao paste, liqueur, cocoa mass, ceremonial cacao in its molten phase. What we would do after that is we would, pour it into either a mold or a dish and let it set until it becomes solid. If we were to make cocoa powder or cocoa butter, instead of letting that set and become solid, we would put that whole thing into a giant industrial press while it's molten and melted, while it's still at 100% cacao, and we would squeeze that under super high pressure to get the butter out. So the cocoa butter would naturally express and separate out from the powder. And then we'd have this cocoa butter, which of course becomes solid at room temperature. And then we have a big cake, like a press cake of cocoa powder. And then usually a machine is used to grind down that cocoa powder. And if you remember what I was saying about the important thing about absorbing all of this good stuff that's in cacao is that we want to have fat there. So to refine out the fat, to refine out the lipids, to make cocoa powder, we don't actually, there's something in the fat, and I don't know what it is yet. The research has not been done on it yet. Elephant crossing. We don't want to remove the fat, so we don't really want it to actually be a powder. We want it to be in its whole, we want it to be in that whole unrefined form. So I would specifically look for ceremonial cacao to do that. If you can't find that, you can buy 100% cacao chocolate bars and take hot water and put that in a blender and take 100% cacao chocolate bar and drop that in the blender. But typically, people that are making ceremonial cacao, like me, there are a few other people that are doing it in the world. There's a lot of it coming out of Guatemala right now, mostly due to the Maya that are there, that are really trying to preserve and also champion their treasure, their cultural treasure that we have them to thank for. So they're really kind of pushing ceremonial cacao out into the world as well. So look for ceremonial cacao. A long answer, but any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on Keith, the cacao shaman, and will you say a little bit more about the entheogenic effects of cacao and how it's represented in a lot of the cultures in South America as this sort of divine medicine? Thank you.
Definitely, that was exactly where I was going to go next. We'll add Keith in there too. Keith should be appreciated for his commitment and his success in evangelizing the use of cacao in this way. This is historically Maya and the Aztec and several other cultures from Central and South America. You would say it's their cultural legacy. And I think Keith has acted as a great bridge between the Maya around Mecatitlan, Guatemala, and other parts of Guatemala where cacao actually grows. So Keith, of course, lives in Atitlan, which cacao doesn't really grow there; it's too cool. He travels to other parts of Guatemala to source cacao, the places where I source cacao from as well. Which actually reminds me, we should probably pass around some chocolate. This is my amazing partner, Ellie. She's going to talk about entheogenic adjuncts botanical allies to entheogenic journeys momentarily. Pass these ones around this way. This is Guatemalan cacao. This is actually just a dark chocolate. Yeah, thank you. From San Juan Chivite, which is part of the Alta Verapaz region, which is where a lot of cacao in Guatemala grows. So, let's talk about the entheogenic aspects of cacao. Like I had mentioned earlier, cacao is really interesting because it is this diverse food, medicine, drug. It has all of these different compounds, all of these different naturally occurring chemicals in it that influence our physiology and influence our state of mind. And all of the different types of cacao from around the world express these compounds in different levels. So you guys are probably familiar with wine and terroir and this concept of, the sense of place of where a food or a spice or even like coffee is grown will impart different things in terms of the flavor to it, right? Like different nuances of flavor come from different growing regions for all of these different things. And that's of course influenced by fermentation as well, particularly with wine and coffee. So cacao contains over 750 compounds in it that contribute to flavor and aroma, which is more than wine, more than coffee. In addition to that, it has, a dozen or so compounds or more that actually contribute to the physiological and mental state that it elicits. Unlike, wine is going to have its alcohol, coffee is going to have its caffeine, and maybe there's some arachidonic acid in there as well that contribute to our experience of coffee or wine. Cacao has all of these different compounds in it that act together synergistically to influence our consciousness, which make it a really interesting tool and teacher for diversity, and in my opinion, a really interesting tool for appreciating the differences that all of us have as humans and how we experience in the world based on our own inherent biological, physiological programming through our genes, through how our brains actually work. Because, if we know coffee only has caffeine in it, then we can say something like, well, caffeine's too stimulating for me, I don't really like consuming a lot of caffeine. Cacao is very unique amongst the plant queendom and amongst other entheogenic plants and teacher plants, in that it has so many different things happening for it, that the experience that we all have from it is very different. And that's based on the fact that all of our brains and bodies have different, are set up completely differently. So some people might be really sensitive to stimulating compounds, of which cacao does have some. So cacao has theobromine in it and caffeine in it. A lot of people will tell you that cacao does not contain any caffeine, and even if you look at a lot of the scientific research that's been published, it'll say cacao has, maybe 10 to 20 milligrams of caffeine per chocolate bar, and 400 milligrams of theobromine, which is another, they're both methylxanthine, so they're both structurally related to each other. Theophylline is another one. These are all contained within tea, of course, and tea has all three of them. Yerba mate has a lot more theobromine and theophylline in it than it does caffeine, which is, but they're all slightly stimulating. Also slightly vasodilatory. Theobromine in cacao is actually still in the U.S. pharmacopoeia as an asthma medication because of its vasodilatory effect. So some people consume cacao, consume this like ritual ceremonial dose of chocolate and get really stimulated. Want to get up, go on a dance, want to, talk, etc. Other people might be more sedated, might be more mellow, might have more of a body high. So cacao also has compounds in it that inhibit the breakdown of our body's own naturally occurring anandamide. So anandamide is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter that we have in our body that works in our endocannabinoid system. And of course, you could probably guess by the name, the endocannabinoid system is where things like THC and CBD from cannabis interact with in our own body. So those are the receptor sites that we have in our physiology, the kind of the lock and key system that THC would fit into. And of course, we wouldn't have those receptor sites unless there was something in our body that was probably working there also, and it's not anandamide. So throughout the course of our day, we're producing anandamide. We're also breaking it down simultaneously, so we're not, walking around all day in a completely blissed out, like stony state of mind. Evolutionarily speaking, we had to cut that out at some point and remember to eat, drink water. But this is why I've given cacao to probably thousands of people at this point, and seen people be very relaxed, almost like stoned. And I think that's because their physiology of their body might have either a proliferance of these endocannabinoid receptor sites, or there are a bunch of different neurological or neuropharmacological explanations of why that could happen. But suffice to say that we're all super different. So in addition to that, cacao has a lot of compounds in it that actually feed these receptor systems. So things like L-dopa, things like arginine, things like tryptophan, tryptamine, that act as the neuropharmacological building blocks to things like serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, and things like that in our bodies, in our physiologies, that influence our state of mind. So somebody that might be naturally lower in serotonin might just have a light mood uplift, and they might be down a couple days out of the month. They might be down one afternoon, and their natural propensity might just be to grab a little piece of chocolate, have that little chocolate bar, and they just get that little bit of tryptophan that their body needs to use as a building block to store or replenish a level of serotonin that they need to feel a little bit better about their day. So, in addition to that, we have compounds called beta-carbolines. So people are probably familiar with ayahuasca as a plant medicine. So ayahuasca, of course, contains DMT, which is thought to not be orally active, and beta-carboline compounds, or otherwise known as MAOIs. So MAOIs inhibit the breakdown of monoamine compounds. Monoamine compounds, the ones that our body naturally produces, are serotonin, dopamine, and different types of catecholamines like those that influence our mind and influence our mood. So not only are we supporting our body to actually produce more of these compounds by giving it these building blocks in chocolate and cacao to actually allow our body to create more of them, we're consuming small amounts of a substance that slows the breakdown of those compounds at the same time. So you're kind of hitting it from all angles, hitting those mood elevating compounds from all angles. And this is kind of like in contrast to like taking MDMA, for example, where you're just going to have a huge release of all of the serotonin you might have into the synapse without also consuming the building blocks to replenish and things like that. So it's a much more subtle experience for your physiology, and also one that's not really going to be as draining. And also, just since I brought up the MAO inhibition and the beta-carboline thing, it's important to know that beta-carbolines are pretty serious compounds. So you guys are probably familiar with ayahuasca and this idea of doing plant diets and having a very pure diet and things that you adjust either before, during, or after an experience. And that historically is because these, monoamines, if we're taking too much of them and our body can't actually break them down, this can potentially be a pretty problematic physiological state. So I think this is why they say, well, I guess if you were taking things that were structurally similar to catecholamines, like an amphetamine or a stimulant, or a psychedelic compound like a MDMA or a 2CB or DMT, psilocybin mushrooms or something like that, you're going to slow the breakdown of those things. So cacao is actually going to could potentially act as a potentiator for those things. And it's important to note that because, especially out here, people are like using all different types of substances. Oh, I'm feeling really tired. I want to take an Adderall, but I just had the ceremonial cacao earlier, and it's potentially palpitations, super intense headache. Been drinking, it's probably going to intensify your hangover like crazy because it's going to slow down your body's ability to actually metabolize and process some of these compounds. So we just say that as a exercise caution when working with MEO inhibitors. There's not a culture around exercising caution around using those like there is with ayahuasca. And nowadays, like the people that are actually administering ceremonial cacao are often doing it in a very different context than it was done historically, and are typically white and don't have like a necessarily connection to that lineage. So it's important to know to probably not be using, especially pharmaceutical compounds that work like a antidepressant. Long-term antidepressants also work in a similar fashion. I don't want to get too deep into that, but suffice to say, if you're taking kind of like a long-term antidepressant, it probably is not a good idea for you to take a large ceremonial dose of cacao where you're getting a huge kind of hit of these things into your physiology and into your bloodstream. Does that kind of make sense?
So you're saying there are MDOIs in
Yeah, there's tetrahydrobeta-carboline in cacao, which is the same type of beta-carboline that's actually in ayahuasca. And in a geeky scientific way, it's also what you guys seen these scorpions that are black light. These black light reactive scorpions. You can look them up on the internet. Beta-carboline compounds are UV reactive, and these scorpions kind of like phosphoresce or glow in the dark, essentially because their entire shell is made out of this compound, tetrahydrobeta-carboline, and related compounds. So, what else? Yeah, I don't know, I have this weird interest in psychedelic bugs. You guys seen this new, there's a cicada that produces psilocybin? There's do people have heard of Cordyceps mushroom? Cordyceps is essentially a parasitic fungi that attacks this particular type of ant in the Himalayas, and then for one reason or another causes it to kind of get out of its colony or out of the grasses, seek a higher up place, and then the mushroom sprouts out of its head, releases a bunch of spores, and they scatter to wind. And this mushroom is used medicinally. It's a good tonic for your physiology. It's an adaptogen. They've discovered just recently that there's this parasitic fungi that attacks cicadas that produces psilocybin. This is the first time psilocybin has been found in this form. It also produces cathinone, which is even more obscure, but cathinone is from the khat plant, which has been used like ceremonially by Sufis. It's like a stimulating, euphoric, uplifting compound plant that has to be chewed fresh, and like the cacao fruit, we can't get it here because it doesn't grow naturally. There's cathinone in it. Cathinone is chemically what was used to synthetically derive what became bath salts, which are pretty gnarly. People have probably heard more of those, but anyway, I'm not here to talk about psychedelic chemistry, but I love talking about psychedelic chemistry. Questions? Right, so question about harmaline. and harmaline is a different type of MAO inhibitor. So harmaline is one of the beta-carboline compounds, and harmaline, harmine are what you would say are the generic or the common names to the chemical name. So tetrahydrobeta-carboline is what is a more kind of geeky chemical name, and I don't remember which one that is. There are several in the class of compounds, but harmine, harmaline, there are a ton of other types of slightly different compounds, and harmaline is just one of these beta-carbolines. And so, like the one that's in cacao and ayahuasca, I believe harmine is also in ayahuasca. I think ayahuasca has a few different types of these compounds, whereas cacao only has the one. They are going to be responsible for slowing the breakdown of these monoamine and amine classes of compounds. So they're going to slow down the breakdown of DMT, which is what makes ayahuasca possible and active thing. It's also why, historically speaking, in areas of the world where psilocybin mushrooms have naturally existed, cacao was actually consumed side by side with psilocybin mushrooms. And those of you that don't know, psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybin is 4-hydroxy DMT. So it's a DMT molecule with the hydroxy group added in the forward position. So very, very similar structurally to DMT. So you could say that ayahuasca is this combination of two plants, one that contains these beta-carboline compounds and one that contains just DMT, straight DMT. And then historically speaking, in different parts of Central America in particular, probably in South America as well, that cacao was consumed in conjunction with psilocybin-producing mushrooms to essentially produce what would be like a chacahuasca or something, kind of like that. So, similar thing. That would be in kind of central Mexico, the Mazatec mushroom ceremony, which is, you might be familiar with Maria Sabina, her work. So traditional Mazatec mushroom ceremony is a small number of cocoa beans, the psilocybin mushrooms, and a small amount of honey consumed together. And this type of ceremony is still a bit more underground, you could say. It hasn't become as a pop cultural phenomenon like ayahuasca has been. So it's a Mazatec, and Mazatec are a people from... the Mazatec is the name of the people, so you would say it was the Mazatec mushroom ceremony, whereas ayahuasca would refer to the actual brew itself. And there are there are actually tons of different cultures that practice the ayahuasca. I think it's called yahe. There's many, many different names for ayahuasca depending on where you are throughout South America. And I believe that at one point, the combination of psilocybin mushrooms and cacao had a similar place, probably more from the Mayan regions of Central America. So Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, etc., all the way up the trade routes with the Aztec, and even potentially up into parts of the Southwest and into Texas, where we still have carbon-dated pottery shards all the way up into Texas and Arizona, I believe, with residuals of cacao up there. So, yeah.
What was the name of the lady you talked about?
Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina was a Mazatec curandera from Mexico, who was the first person to give psilocybin mushrooms to Westerners. So R. Gordon Wasson, who's actually I can't remember which. He was essentially a banker. Is in the financial industry, but also had a very intense hobby around mycology and the world's mushroom traditions, and brought a bunch of people down to Mexico to try to find this sacred mushroom that Tiananmen and Maria Sabino was the first person to actually give it to a Westerner, Arthur Horton Watson and his group of people. So and later, of course, Albert Kaufman went there and he synthesized LSD for the first time. We have to thank for LSD. Went down and took back samples of psilocybin mushrooms and isolated psilocybin from them and identified the structure of psilocybin. Yeah, entheogens, cacao. I cover all of the bases with cacao. There's so many different compounds in it. I definitely just scratch the surface. We should talk about aphrodisiac components of cacao, since we're talking about how cacao makes you feel. Those other compounds, we have the catechin compounds that are in cacao, the antioxidant compounds, and one of the secondary actions of these catechins is they actually upregulate an enzyme in the body that we have called nitric oxide synthase. Nitric oxide is our body's only gaseous neurotransmitter, which means it perfuses and moves through the tissue very, very quickly. It's also what is kind of responsible for tissue that becomes erect. So, whether you're a man or a woman, you have tissue that becomes erect in the physiology, and nitric oxide is one of the things that's responsible for that. So it also increases kind of skin sensitivity, skin flushing, and things like that. So, and that's very much a component of cacao. So that's even, throughout history from when the Spaniards brought it back to Spain, and you have Giacomo Casanova essentially using it to seduce these women of the European aristocracy into bed with them, all the way back to Montezuma drinking 40 golden goblets of cacao a day to hang out in his harem. So it goes back to this nitric oxide and the ability of cacao to increase the tissue levels of nitrous oxide in the body, which kind of go, we don't even talk about phenethylamine. Silly me. So phenethylamine, who knows what compounds are based on phenethylamine? We're in the psychedelic tent here. This is great. I don't get to talk about this when I go to the fancy food show, right? And these trade expos and things. Let's pick up. We'll pass around another chocolate too, and we'll try to get close to wrapping up. I'm sure I'm close to time here. We'll talk about phenethylamine. Phenethylamine is a compound that's in cacao, of which Sasha Shulgin, the chemist that we have to thank for things like 2CB, anything 2C, are all from Sasha. Also a lot of the tryptamines that we know about, exotic tryptamines, substituted tryptamines, which I mentioned weren't tryptamine as a compound is in cacao. It's also in a lot of our food. It's a relatively simple compound that our body can use as building blocks for things like serotonin. Serotonin just being 5-hydroxytryptamine. Phenethylamine, the different compound, essentially has an amphetamine-like backbone. Adding different functional groups onto it will turn it into 2CB, will turn it into mescaline, will turn it into MDMA. So cacao has phenethylamine in it, which phenethylamine in its pure form just releases a lot of the same compounds that a lot of these entheogenic compounds release. So things like adrenaline, epinephrine, serotonin, and of course dopamine. Phenethylamine is also an endogenous compound to our body and our physiology, and one that we're both creating and breaking down naturally all the time. Phenethylamine is associated with human states of love, human states of desire, consciousness, and particularly like that, like yearning, like, oh God, I want that. So cacao contains this kind of compound in it, and a lot of people will say, especially if you look online or even in some of the books on chocolate, well, phenethylamine doesn't do anything in chocolate because we break it down too quickly. We have way too much monoamine oxidase naturally in our gut that when we consume chocolate bars, we don't get any of that phenethylamine. But they don't know that there's MAO inhibitors also naturally present in cacao that are working to slow the breakdown of that phenethylamine in our gut so we can actually absorb it into our body. And then just to finish all of that off, to tie it all kind of back together and why we want to consume cacao in this kind of unrefined ceremonial whole form where it still has the fat in it. So there's this idea called dose dumping. And typically this is something you would want to avoid. So this is something where you would take like a particular pharmaceutical medicine with a type of food or a type of substance that really intensely increases its bioavailability and its absorption into your bloodstream. So typically the idea of dose dumping is something that like a medical doctor would tell you, like, this is a new medication I'm going to put you on. I want you to make sure you're not consuming it with a lot of fat or a lot of this other type of food or something very acidic, because you're going to absorb a lot of it into your bloodstream, and that's going to be problematic with another medication I might have you on. However, in terms of cacao, this idea of dose dumping is what I believe, and this is one of the things where science, there isn't science on this, so this is, just to be clear, this is my own opinion. The fats that are actually in the cacao and having them warm in our body while we're consuming the cacao are actually what increase the absorption and the availability of all of these compounds into our bloodstream really, really rapidly. And it's also why, like, when you have like a chocolate bar, even if you eat a whole chocolate bar, in my opinion, it's more consistently a stimulating experience, because the theobromine isn't going to get broken down. The caffeine's not going to get broken down by the monoamine oxidase. It's all of these other compounds, the phenethylamine and all of this stuff, that are going to get broken down by the MAO that's in your stomach. So having a whole chocolate bar, maybe you're just going to get kind of stimulated if you eat the whole thing, versus having a hot, warm beverage with the fat like mixed in and emulsified. You're going to absorb a lot of that very, very quickly. It's also a lot of the times why, if you actually go to a modern cacao ceremony nowadays, it's much more like ayahuasca, where you're encouraged to typically drink the cup a little bit quicker, so you can get a lot of it into your bloodstream much more rapidly, and then have a second cup as needed. I think maybe if anyone has any burning a question or two, otherwise I'd love to wrap up, pass it along. Oh, did we pass along the golden milk? So just in terms of cacao as a delivery for plant medicine, we're passing around this golden milk chocolate, which is essentially a white chocolate, but melted and mixed with turmeric, which needs to be warmed in the presence of fat to actually release its bioavailability. So making chocolate out of it was, for me, something that was like, wow, this is a natural and a no-brainer. Also happens to taste really delicious. I have a couple of cards. If any of you guys want to stay in touch with me, I'd be happy to give you my contact info. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for listening to me rap about cacao. I hope you have a lovely burn.